My name is Jeff Wasserstrom. I teach in the history department here, and I'm here in my capacity as one of the people heavily involved in the Forum for the Academy and the Public, which is an organization that's putting on this event in collaboration with the Persian Studies Center, the Jordan Center, and with the history department. The Forum for the Academy and the Public, which was started by a group of historians, literary journalism, faculty, and law professors, does a big event every year that brings together, that is planned a year in advance and pulls people together in very much of a standard kind of university way, except that we have people, journalists from the fields of journalism and the arts in dialogue with faculty. So it's unusual in that way. But we also started doing something called pop-up events several years ago, which try to circumvent the planning processes that universities go through and talk about things that have a sense of urgency that are in the news at a particular moment in time. And this is our first pop-up event in quite a while in person. We did some online in the past, and we're bringing together a story that was in the headlines in 2019 and 2020, the protests and repression in Hong Kong, together with a story that is in the headlines right now, the protests and repression going on in Iran. These stories have overlapped in different ways. In 2019, there were stories about protests in both places. There were reasons why the Hong Kong protests, the Hong Kong situation, though out of the headlines, could and should be back in the headlines because the stories continue in that way. But also, there are two kinds of events, and this is something that the Forum strives to do, to get people in different fields in dialogue with each other who are dealing with the same issues but might not ordinarily cross paths. Iran and Hong Kong are two places that are not usually studied by the same people. They often are not discussed together, but as I was following the news coming out of Iran recently, I kept seeing stories that had echoes for me as a China specialist, either of what had happened in China in 1989 during the massive upheaval then that ended with the June 4th massacre of the Tiananmen Square, or things that were that reminded me of things about Hong Kong in 2019, another story that I followed closely. The kinds of things, even sometimes that people who followed Iran were telling me they thought were unusual or unique, some of them resonated with things that I had grown familiar to in the case of Hong Kong. For example, very young protesters being at the center of things, women playing very dramatic roles. These were things about the 2019 story. Also a sense of solidarity across generational lines, even a youth movement, but with people of other generations joining in as well. There are, of course, things that are very different. There are things that maybe are somewhat similar to China in 1989, but not like Hong Kong in 2019 about the Iran story. There are things that are unique about the Iran story. There may be other kinds of comparisons we need to delve into. But I thought one way, or we thought, Amy Willans is the director of the Forum for the Academy and the Public, and we developed these things together, was to get people with different expertise together. So we have somebody who played an active role in Hong Kong's story, Nathan Law, who will be more fully introduced by Craig Calhoun, the moderator. And we also have Pardees Mahdavi, who has been studying, has had an ongoing career of working on issues of gender and politics in Iran. So it's really wonderful that both of them are able to be here on the same stage to compare ideas. Craig Calhoun, who I will introduce before he introduces them, is a perfect person to be a moderator for a discussion like this. He is
because they're radical extremists and I'm moderate.
Seriously, he is a long-term study of comparative social movements. We're lucky to now have him almost in the neighborhood at Arizona State University. So we can bring people from all different places. But an added thing about Craig is that he happened to be teaching social movements in Beijing in 1989 when the protests of that year took place. So having him moderate both as a theorist and writer on issues of democracy in many parts of the world and places, but also as somebody who had direct experience of looking at an event following and tracking an event and writing a very good book about it, Neither Gods Nor Emperors, later for University of California Press, he can draw on that kind of old experience to talk about the newer stories that are in the news right now. So without further ado, a bit of housekeeping. This is taking place in person, in real life, as those of you who are here realize. It's also taking place via, people can watch via Zoom. Questions will only be taken from people who are in the room, however. Unless anybody who follows me on Twitter and I follow them and wants to DM me a message, I will see about taking that question from any of the Zoom audience. But I also wanted to say that in the Q&A, because of the sensitivity of this, the camera will not be pointed to anybody who is asking a question, and you do not need to identify yourself. If we put this up later as a recording, your identity will not be revealed that way. So here we'll just have a free-ranging conversation here with then some questions afterwards. Thanks very much. Greg, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thanks to the forum and UCI for the chance to be here and be a part of what I think will be a really interesting conversation. I want to say first that we conceive of this as a conversation. Neither Nathan nor Pardees is planning to give simply a speech. We're going to try to engage with each other around the different cases that animate this particular conversation about democracy, its possibilities, about the limits and obstacles faced by democratic movements. So let me say just a few general words, then introduce each of Nathan and Pardees. The general words are just to recall something that may be vanishing from memory for some people with embarrassment, for some people with a genuine sense of loss, which is how widespread the enthusiasm for democracy was 30 years ago. So in the wake of 1989, in the wake of the Tiananmen Square June 4th protest movement in China, in the wake of the crisis and ultimate termination of the Soviet Union, there was an enormous sense of optimism about democracy, often illusory, right? Exaggerated. Even at the time, some people would say, well, the discourse of the end of history associated with Francis Fukuyama was exaggerated in its optimism. There wasn't going to be an end of history. There were going to still be struggles, but, right, there was a sense that democracy was being seen as the normal path of progress. That's where countries were headed. They might be headed faster or slower by slightly different paths, but they were headed there. That feeling hit a number of blockages, a number of bumps in the road, a number of painful moments over the ensuing years. None perhaps more painful than the Hong Kong experience, right? Which in terms of Nathan's engagement, it kind of comes to a head around 2017, but it comes to a head more than once, right? And it is an experience that is shaped, I want to suggest, I want to say, by both the optimism, yes, we can make democracy happen, and the painful realization of the obstacles and the capacities for repression of others. And I think it's a lot of that story. The illusions about democracy don't disqualify optimism. The aspiration that students felt in Beijing in 1989, and not only in Beijing, in a variety of cities, and indeed in Hong Kong in 1989. The optimism that many felt in the former Soviet Union as they tried to rebuild democracy in various national structures, including in Ukraine. And the optimism that people felt in the occupied movements, in the Arab world, in the Western world, and in various settings. Now, Iran is also a part of this story, though the momentum, the timetable, the periodization is sort of different. 1979 assumes this pivotal importance for the Islamic Revolution. And various movements after that seek to change the course of it. Parties tell us more about that. But in the era of the Occupy movements, there's a remarkable movement in Iran to reconstruction. But it's as remarkable, I think, for being a moment when the optimistic and heroic willingness of people to enter into the public in order to try to achieve a greater extent of democratic freedom confronts capacities for repression. And when protesters who have thought these new technologies, like Twitter, which was contrary to public knowledge, was not invented for Jeff Wasserstein, however much he uses it. I believe he's second only to Elon Musk. The new electronic technologies, which have been important in galvanizing activism in a variety of settings in Seattle and in Genoa against the WTO and various things, are important to Iranian students, but they are at least equally empowering of the state apparatus and its capacities for surveillance and repression. So here Iran becomes a pivotal place where people learn painfully the other side of that coin, of how technology had been a part of a liberating passage. Well, we've gone through a lot of ups and downs. I've just written a book called Degenerations of Democracy, and I'll make only this remark about it, which is that this is part of the histories of democracy. Americans will be familiar with sort of school book stories in which we're always democratic and we're always getting better. And it's just a story of progress. You know, the US is not fully democratic at its inception. Right? Their full participation in democracy is denied to enslaved people, to women, to white men without property. It takes a long time, a lot of struggle. There's a civil war. America's story is not a simple story of progress. Democracy degenerates and has to be renewed over and over again. Well, this goes on around the world and in various settings. We are in one of the low points for democracy at the moment, but it doesn't mean that the aspirations have gone away and the potential for renewal is absent. We are living in a world of, moreover, of dysfunctional connections and countries in troubled times in their history. Brief note on history here is we often in the past and still in some settings have narrated history as though it was just national stories, one country at a time. But what is important about bringing together the story of Hong Kong and China, the story of Iran, and other stories in this moment is that we see how entangled the histories are. We see that they are not just one country at a time. We see that this is a world of empires and the footprints of former empires shaped, for example, Hong Kong, conjunction between two different empires, and Iran, once the world's greatest empire, the Persian Empire, and in a region where all the politics is along the fault lines of empires to this day. But it's also a world of movements, and movements that should be remembered. I make a comment on the Tiananmen Square protest, not just for their conclusion, say June 4th, when we talk about that, but we should remember all the weeks and months of organizing and activism before that. We shouldn't celebrate just the moment of repression. It's terrific to have Nathan Law. Here's one of the speakers. Nathan is known to some of you, I think, as an author. He wasn't always an author. He started out, like many of us, as a student. Nathan was an important student leader at Lingnan University, as well as a very good student, and became active in student organizations from his days at Lingnan organizations, but then the Hong Kong Federation of Students. He became a leader in the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. He was one of the founders of Demosisto, a new political party built in the wake of that. He was elected against all sense of what was probable to the Hong Kong Legislative Council. He was arrested in what didn't seem probable or likely at the time, though in retrospect, we can say, well, maybe that was what happened. In 2017, when released, he has maintained a self-imposed exile in the US and especially in the UK since then. And his book, Freedom, how we lose it and how we fight back is an inspiring personal story, but also, I think, a really good path into thinking, as I know along, of the two sides here, the optimism we need to have and the consciousness of potential loss. I'll go ahead and introduce Pardis Nadavi before I launch the conversation. Pardis is the provost and executive vice president of the University of Montana. This is probably a great thing for her. It's a minor tragedy for me because I really liked having her as Dean of Social Sciences at Arizona State University and didn't want her to move to Montana, but she did. Before being a dean at ASU, she was a dean at the Corbell School in Denver and in Los Angeles at Occidental. Pomona, you went to
I went to Oxford. Rami was here for at the same time, but yeah.
Pomona Archers, Dean. She's an accomplished scholar of a variety of themes in Middle Eastern studies. And as a former leader of the SSRC, I like to claim her as one of our own from the Social Science Research Council Fellows and leadership. She studied, in addition to Occidental, at Columbia. Among her books are major studies on Iran, but also major studies on transnational phenomena that are reshaping the Middle East. So her book, Passionate Uprisings on Iran's Sexual Revolution, is important. So is her book, Gridlock, Labor, Migration, and Human Trafficking, which looks at the way these come together in places like Dubai, but stretching in a variety of ways around the region. She's also the author of From Trafficking to Terror, to take up another dimension of the torn social fabric which troubles us all today. So that's it from me, nothing more except some questions. And let me invite Nathan to kick off with what's most on your mind now about your experience in Hong Kong and what's happening.
Well, I have a very levelist mind now because I landed from London yesterday, so I'm suffering from jet lag. So if I lost my mind in the middle of the discussion, please pardon me. But yeah, I think I'm lucky. I'm extremely lucky to be able to sit here and to share with all of you because most of my friends in Hong Kong, most political activists are in jail. Some of my closest allies, Joshua Wong, who have been together, like fighting, protesting for more than 6 years. We found them still together, has already been jailed for more than 600 days without knowing when he would get out because a proper trial has not yet begun. Benny Tai, Jimmy Lai, some of the big names in Hong Kong's political movement. There are some political analysts expecting that they are not going to get out from the jail alive. So this is the daunting reality of Hong Kong. I was very lucky that I managed to leave Hong Kong after I was a legislator. I was a political prisoner. I left Hong Kong a few days before the implementation of the National Security Law in 2020 June, which it outlaws all peaceful protest, it criminalizes free speech, and is very convenient to for the government to put all those political activists behind bars. For now, I would say that Hong Kong is getting more and more like closer to an ordinary Chinese city, which it once was seen as the Pearl of Orient, one of the most free Asian city, even though it has never had its democracy, but it maintained a facade of a very liberal and international financial center, which back then Beijing needs it to attract foreign investment to provide professional services, which for now they less and less needed it. So that's the background of Hong Kong, and I think for me is we talk about democracy, we talk about it as a gradual process, and I think it applies on social movement too. If we wanted to understand the Hong Kong 2019 movement, which I bet every one of you have watched certain news about, millions of people marching down to the streets, or like petrol bombs flying over a very crowded city, which is actually surreal for Hong Kong. But every one of us saw that. We thought it was an explosion of people's anger. We thought it was like one-off thing. But if we look back to the history of Hong Kong, we've had many people consider the birth of like Hong Kong civil society in 1959, the kind of like support for the Tiananmen students and the democracy movement in China in general. And we had the 2003 rally opposing the back then laws really close to the national security law that we have. And then there were protests in 2012, 2014, and then until now, there has always been democratic movement in Hong Kong is for decades. And we've seen a gradual transition to very peaceful orderly rally to civil disobedience movement and to a more violent conflict, just because of how much the government are not held accountable and how much police violence has been increased along those years. And we've seen more and more participation from people from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds. At the peak of the 2019 protests, there were more than 2 million people marching down the streets, which, if you consider Hong Kong as a city with a population of 7.5 million, which that was already more than a quarter of the population. If any of a quarter of the population like go down to the streets and protest in any major cities or states in the US, politics will be changed immediately. But that's not the case in Hong Kong. So when we look back to all those traits and the continuity of social movement, we've seen a very vibrant political community that really glue us together with a strong identity and strong sense of history. But for now, of course, we witness the demise of the civil society of Hong Kong. As the one in mainland China, if we look at what Xi Jinping did when he first resumed power, the first thing he did was to demolish the already very constricted environment for civil society in mainland China. And it kind of like continued that trend to Hong Kong post 2019 protest periods. We've seen more than dozens of political organizations disbanded. We've seen basically all the independent media outlets which were critical to the Chinese government also disbanded. We've seen massive self-censorship. One of the example was that there were protests in Beijing a few days ago when there was a brave dissident displaying sign in one of the most busiest districts in Beijing, saying no to dictatorship and no like strict COVID rules. And there were no Hong Kong media picking it up. If it were in 5 years ago, all the major news outlet in Hong Kong would deploy like teams to Beijing, taking interviews, doing deep analysis. But for now, none of them reported that incident. There were one online media did that, which we consider as a very pro-Beijing media, but it retreated it a few hours after that. So we've seen erosion of freedom, a demise of civil society, and for now, yes, the situation is really, really dire. One of the major reasons is, I think, the Chinese Communist Party now is just too competent and too vigilant. We've had a period of time after Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government after 1997, which we had a peaceful time. Hong Kong people, even though we did not have democracy, we expect Beijing to deliver its promise that we will gradually arrive to the stage that we will enjoy democracy and freedom. And that was the time also Beijing had to convince the outer world that yes, we are catching up the West liberal models. We are trying to be good player in the world. We're trying to hide and buy. That was the kind of like term that coined Beijing's foreign policy in the year around early 2000 and to 2010 at the end. And that was the time Hong Kong played its role. The kind of like promised freedom that Hong Kong enjoyed, the kind of like gradual process to democracy, the kind of like harmonious relationship between the Chinese government and the Hong Kong people helped Beijing to paint the picture, saying that we are actually learning from Hong Kong. We're actually learning from a city which has a really good tradition of liberalism and freedom, and we are trying to be a player that we will. There are lots of things for us to learn. But of course, for now, in Beijing's eyes, they are the best political system in the world. They are having the time of their life. They're saying that all the other system do not work. Xi Jinping is very confident over it, and there's no need for them to use Hong Kong as an example to show that we're catching up certain liberalism in the West. Rather, they would say that you should learn from me. I should reform the world system in order for me to be more influential and to have more protection over my authoritarianism. And I think that falls into the background of the demise of Hong Kong. So to conclude, I think Craig point out that we are in the kind of like democratic backsliding. It's already been there. It's more than decades of it. And one of the major reasons, I think, is we have been very complacent and not developing any mechanism to hold dictators accountable, especially the rise of Chinese authoritarianism for the past decade or two. And the kind of collateral consequences, the demise of Hong Kong. So the kind of Hong Kong protest and the ramification following after that is actually a sad footnote of the global democratic reception.
That's a sad note to end on, so I will come back to you momentarily because I want to believe that these struggles are more than a footnote. And I want to ask you more about how that can be lived to, and something your book, I will say, does take up the potential renewal. But let me turn for a moment to Pardis and invite her to reflect on the current situation in Iran and of Iran in the world. Iran never been out of the news, but it's very much back in the news right now, and back in the news with various protests and strikes and acts of defiance of the regime and questions about what's going on and what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so you asked Nathan what's been on his mind. I think for me, I've been thinking a lot about recently Shirin Ebadi, who's the only female to win the Nobel Prize from Iran some years ago. She said that women are going to open the gates to democracy in Iran. And I think I would add to that, not just women, but young women. And so one of the things that really strikes me about this moment in Iran is the intergenerational nature of it. I mean, truly intergenerational, right? So, you know, when you look on social media, when you look at the images of the protests in Iran, you can see not just women at the forefront, but young girls, right? And schoolgirls. You see girls at the ages of 10, 11, 12. And I think we have to pause for a moment and reflect on this generation, because this is a generation that's been born into resistance, right? My generation, you know, we're children of the revolution, right? Born into the time of the revolution, didn't know what life was like before the Islamic Republic. And so my generation, I think, was laying some of the groundwork. And you know, Nathan, you talked about sort of these rounds of protests. And I think one of the things I have been studying since the late 1990s are the protests that my generation, the children of the revolution, have been engaging. But who you see leading this movement are not the children of the revolution. I call them the children of the resistance, because they were born into a moment where we were already doing that resisting. We were already articulating that the facade of democracy that the Islamic Republic had brought about was indeed just that, a facade, right? That you had elections that were performative. And so if you think about the Green Movement that Craig talked about, you know, in 2009, the Green Movement, really the slogan was "Not my president, where is my vote?" Because there had been fraudulent elections that had taken place where Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was reelected, and you know, people were pouring into the streets. And so when you think about the schoolgirls who are protesting, they were born right around then, right? So they were born right around the Green Movement, born into the Arab Spring, and sort of born into seeing protests. And I think what's really important is that they are standing up bravely, despite the odds, despite the fact that, you know, they're met with tear gas and brutality over and over again. They're still out there every day. They're out there in the squares and they keep saying, we're not going home. To add to that, you know, people say, well, how is it different this time around than 2009? How do we make sure that it's not a footnote in history? And I think one of the things that strikes me as well is these same schoolgirls and boys some of the images you see are of them tearing out pages of Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, and they're ripping up, pictures of the supreme leader. That's what we heard about, during the revolution of 1779. People were ripping up photographs of the Shah, and now you've got people ripping up photographs of the supreme leader. So it runs pretty deep. At the same time, these schoolgirls, this generation is joined by my generation, the children of the revolution, as well as my parents' generation. And so the truly intergenerational moment here, where people are bringing all of the past experiences, each wave of successive protests gets stronger and bigger. It makes it so that maybe the footnotes combined start to become a groundswell. So, I've been thinking a lot about street politics, right? And how do street politics operate? What do they look like? How do people use their bodies to speak back, right? So what you see in Iran today is people have been using their bodies, comporting their resistance, right? This is a regime that came to power under a fabric of morality. So they question the regime by tearing away and chipping away at that fabric. That's what the headscarf burning, et cetera, is about. But really, the question I think many of us are asking ourselves is, what is the tipping point? And are we at the tipping point? I mean, people often say, well, what do the protesters want? Do they want reform? And I think that we're past reform. I think we're really at the stage of revolution now, right? I mean, the fact that the protests have been going on for over a month, that tells us something, despite pretty brutal responses. And then finally, I've been thinking a lot about sort of this moment of, democracy 2.0, human rights 2.0, right? Where, when you think 15 years ago, when you think about people who were writing about democracy and human rights, one of the critiques that ran pretty boldly in at least anthropological literature was that, human rights is sort of this Western construct, democracy is this Western phenomenon, and really, does it apply? Does it translate? Is it legible outside of a Western context? And what you see now is a resounding yes. And you see these organic movements, these grassroots movements. So not a top-down, like, okay, we're coming to bring democracy or we're coming to bring human rights. You see a street politics that reflects a grassroots movement to push not just for women's rights, but to push for human rights, which tells us that human rights are evolving and laying really important foundational groundwork for democracy.
That's a great comment. Actually, that's more cheerful than the footnote.
I tried it, but obviously.
But they can actually, let me ask just a small question, there's some bigger ones to get to about connections here. But it strikes me in what each of you said and what I know each of you have written, that maybe one common theme here is a sense of betrayal and false promise. And it's something I hear very explicitly in Nathan's account of how the Hong Kong democracy movement takes shape, is in demanding that Beijing live up to a promise that it made in the 1997 handover, and which it's quickly forgetting, and refusing. And in the same sense, when you talk about something like the Ahmadinejad re-election, you're, if I hear right, talking about students who say, this is fraudulent, you're betraying it. You promised us that this was a system in which we have elections and they are frauds. And I didn't, sorry, and does this add to the sort of mobilizing capacity in each case?
I mean, I think you're spot on, Craig. I think that sense of betrayal has been running, I'd say pretty much since the revolution, right? You had an Islamist regime that came to power in 1979 under a lot of promises, right? Of, bringing a type of equality and, this anti-West toxication, right? That there was a strong critique of the Shah and the royalists as being overly West toxicated, overly, puppeted by the West, right? And so there was this idea that the Islamist regime is going to come and return Iran to Iranians, and this sense of Iranianness, which then translated to kind of an austerity and a certain type of Iranianness as dictated by the Islamists' interpretation of Islam, right? And so that was, I think, the beginning of that sense of betrayal, right? So you had this regime that came to power that unseated the Shah, and a lot of broken promises. I mean, even in the 80s, it was a pretty clear that this regime was not going to deliver. And so, at the same time, with that sense of betrayal was a sense of disorientation, because you had a lot of Iranians who had, supported the regime. Islamic Marxism had been, one of the things people were reading Shadiati's.
Well, so let me pause for this. So this is a kind of coming together of what had been divergent currents, right? So before 79, there's a communist party. There are followers of Ali Shariati, these sort of theologians, sociologists, thinker, who, if I remember, died a couple years before the revolution. So part of the discussion is, I just want to ask you to elaborate. Everybody came together, we tried to make this work, and we're being betrayed. Is part of the discussion also of what might have been discussion? What if Shariati had lived? What if there had been, could there have been a different possibility in something? Is that also part of it?
That's part of it, and not just Shariati, but what if 1953? Like what, I mean, really, what if Mossadegh had stayed in power, right? I mean, at this point, it's quite over, it's a CIA-backed coup, but what if the democratically elected prime minister who promised oil nationalization, if he had been able to stay in power, what might have been there, right? And so there's a lot of that, especially in this moment, there's a lot of harkening back to what Iran might have been as a way of forecasting what Iran could be.
Including for these young girls and boys who are in the protests. The youth are not without historical consciousness.
Exactly.
They are very much exploring this. Let me turn to Nathan and ask about that in the Hong Kong context. We go back and say, well, 1997 was no more than a compromise from the point of view of many Hong Kong activists who wanted sovereignty, not a compromise that allowed Britain to withdraw in return for promises from Beijing, which would then turn out to be problematic. But there was also this, well, let's make it work under that. And sort of very optimism. How much does the history matter in the Hong Kong?
I think that the betrayal that you mentioned has twofold in Hong Kong's understanding on why we resisted. The first one would definitely be very straightforward, which in the 80s, when there were negotiation between the Chinese government and British government, which Hong Kong people did not involve. In order to kind of like ease the anxiety of Hong Kong people, Beijing promised Hong Kong people that after 1997 will be governed under the system called one country, two system, which means that even though we are in the name in the one country, but the mainland China and Hong Kong, we will enjoy a separate system. Because back then, when Hong Kong people had the idea of a communist China, which had just been through a very turbulent cultural revolution, we had really bad kind of like forecast for Hong Kong's future when we were eventually kind of like going back to the Chinese sovereignty. So there were a big immigration wave in the 80s, and then there is the Tiananmen massacre, which Beijing brutally cracked down the whole pro-democracy movement in mainland China, killed probably thousands of people when they marched for a more just China. And that at that moment, there's another layer of anxiety for Hong Kong people and another wave of immigration. So the whole infrastructure of the one country, two system was that the Chinese authority wanted to comfort Hong Kong people and to ease that anxiety and to prevent Hong Kong people leaving the city when the 1997 handover took place, so that it promised Hong Kong people freedom, democracy, and autonomy in exchange of Hong Kong people's confidence to the city's future and to the Chinese Communist Party. And that became the kind of like fundamental argument for Hong Kong people to fight for democracy, that that is the thing Beijing promised us, and we are asking them to honor their words. And the treaty signs also was tabled in the United Nations that the international community had an obligation to oversee its implementation. So that's the one part of more straightforward thing. But the other part was more about identity. It was more about who are Hong Kong people? Right. Hong Kong before 1997 had been through 115 years of colonial ruling under the British government. We were more like a colonial subject. And there were a lot of times Hong Kong people asked the question like, who am I? Am I a Chinese? Am I British? Or something in between? So there had always been not only anxiety for Hong Kong's future, but anxiety of who we are, the identity. And after 1997, there was a huge campaign of China trying to build up the narrative of like Hong Kong people are Chinese and Chinese are a progressing country and we should be proud of it. There had been a campaign of nationalism building in Hong Kong, just like everywhere else in mainland China after 1997. And I remember that in 2008, when I was around 15, it was the peak of the whole campaign, of the whole engineering work. It was the year of Beijing Olympic. I think most of you had kind of like watched those games. I remember when I was at home, I cheered for the Chinese national team. So the whole public estate, the whole public outing, neighborhood of mine, whenever there was a gold medal, the Chinese national team earns, whenever they climb up the medal ladder, we cheered for them. So that was the time Hong Kong people found like we had an identity, we had a kind of like national identity that we can rely on, and that is on the basis that this country will progress, this country will deliver, this country is someone that align with our values and going to be better. But of course, after that, we've seen huge corruption, we've seen huge demolition of civil society. We've also seen a change of kind of like the policy direction to Hong Kong, which at the beginning from kind of respecting Hong Kong people's autonomy, respecting the way of life of us, into a phase of actively restructuring Hong Kong society in order to curtail those freedom and to be more like a Chinese city. And that was the time we witnessed the rise of localism, which Hong Kong people felt like we were not colonial subject, but we were not Chinese in a way that we expect. Not only we love the country, but the country loved us back, right? So there has always been a saying that we love the country, but the country doesn't love me. So why I should continue to love the country? So there had been that kind of like philosophical discussion in Hong Kong after 2008, when we emerged in a rise of local identity. So I think the betrayal also lies in that sense, which there has been laws of generations of laws of like the identity and who we are, and there had been a really strong national building process, and we thought that we found something that we can rely on, but eventually it wasn't. It was more like when we look back in retrospective goggles, we were actually being ruled by a worse colonizer after 1997.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
I mean, because one of the things I'm thinking about as you're speaking is there's a lot of resonance, right? I hear a lot of similarities. And you know, do you think it's about, you know, who are we, who are Hong Kong people? I mean, I think about that a lot with the protesters, who are we as Iranians? But I also think about who gets to tell the story, right? Not just who are we, but who gets to tell the world the story of who we are. And I think one of the things that you hear really loudly with this round of protests, right? When you hear the chants that, you know, our enemy is right here. Our enemy is not the US, our enemy is right here, right? You've got all these different chants. And a lot of it is about who gets to define and represent Iran to the world. Is Iran really the Islam? Is it the mullahs? Or is Iran the people in the streets today? And so I think in addition to that question of what does it mean to be Iran? Who are Iranians? It's also who gets to tell that story. And I wonder if that's something that you observe as well.
Yes, definitely. It's a matter of representation. It's a matter of like whether one picture triumphs like thousands of words, like a picture of Iranian women like taking off the job, like cutting off the hair, a picture of Hong Kong people like hundreds of thousands or even millions of Hong Kong people on the streets chanting for democracy. I think it really changed the narrative. And it also really ignites the kind of a sense of community, sense of solidarity, and the virtual and the values that coins the national group, or like coins the people. So I think that there is definitely a strong sense in Hong Kong's political movement that we don't want to be represented by the Chinese government. We don't want to be represented by the Hong Kong government, but we want to mark our own ideas and to define who we are by our terms. There has been a really strong tendency of that kind of like elevated in the whole movement. And I think more or less it's also another nation building process for Hong Kong people this time, that we will show the world who we are, and we will show the world that all these people who claim to representing us are not the ones that we have elected, not the ones that we agree.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, but first just note the importance of what you said in response to Bernice about visual media, is I think to our whole era of politics and to each of these two examples, it's extremely important that mobilization is not just taking place by electronic media, that's absolutely true, but electronic media that can send visuals. For the Arab Spring in 2011, visual media are extremely important for cases over and over again, and certainly for all the Hong Kong protests. As you say, the picture we're doing, and it's absolutely going on in Iran right now. So something very powerful, the picture in, as distinct from who will write the history book in a few years, but which is also important. But I ask about the representation issue. I'm asked the same question to parties. Is there a tension in that about 1997 or 1979? That is, it can certainly be said from some quarters, Beijing, for example, that, oh, this Hong Kong fixation with the rule of law is really a British inheritance. It's not Chinese. And the Hong Kong protesters can be said to be embracing an inheritance from Britain, where this isn't democracy. This is the imposition of a colonial power, which gives as a gift some level of freedom for its own purposes, some level of law for its own purposes, but ultimately power is in London. Is there an issue of how to find a voice for claiming rule of law, claiming a structure of rights, claiming a system that originated under colonialism, but is now to be claimed in a more democratic way? Does that introduce a tension into representation?
Yeah, I think there are a few points in this set of arguments that interplaying. And the first one was definitely Beijing's ambition to kind of like overwrite some of the terms that they coin liberalism in their own terms. Like, for example, there are 12 socialist values that Xi Jinping introduced in recent few years. You can see them everywhere. You can see like democracy, rule of law, freedom in every street corner in China. But in that dictionary, like rule of law, it does not mean by the power being held accountable, or you have a like impartial system. It means that you have to obey the law. It's actually ruled by law. When they talk about democracy, they're not saying that you have a universal like suffrage system that people can truly elect their leader. It represents a system that China calls like all people democracy, which they have their ways of understanding how to elect, so-called quote unquote elect, but actually select their leader. And the way of freedom, it falls into the realm of everything you do, you must be inside the spectrum that the authority allows you, so that you can act free at your will. And I think the way that Beijing reconstruction and re-engineer this word really showed its ambition of competing. What are the moral authority? Who are more morally superior in this equation? After, as we know, in recent decade, there's a lack of or a vacuum of moral authority because of what, for example, US has been doing terribly for the past decades. And the second point in this whole kind of like discussion is about what are colonialism, like what what constitutes the people feeling that they are being colonized. It's not just a form of like government. It's about these people, they're not being respected. These people, they're not listened. All the things that these people want are not going to be realized. And I think in that sense, for many Hong Kong people, there's no difference when they face today's Chinese ruling, that many of their aspirations and demands and pursuit are being demolished. For them, China is actually a worse colonizer, given that at the end of the colonial era in Hong Kong, even though like the colonialism in Hong Kong is a very special example in the whole set of discussion of colonialism. But at the end, at the very end, the last at least 2 decades, there were a lot more consultation, and people felt like the governor of Hong Kong, even though they were not elected, but they were being held accountable by a popularly elected parliament in the UK. There were a lot more discussion about actually the last decade of Hong Kong was definitely much more free than the Hong Kong that we have now. So I think in order to answer that question, whether we are just a bunch of people who are nostalgia about colonialism, I think the answer is a resounding no. Is because nowadays the degree of suppression on the rights of self-determination and the process of self-determination of Hong Kong's resident Hong Kong people is actually much more than we had 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I think that is the crux of the whole discussion of it, which I think for now we just have to be really, really firm to say that this is what we want. We want democracy, we want freedom, we want autonomy, and this is what China should give us.
Right. So, and that's really clear in advance. I'm still conscious of still thinking about the rhetorical and representational challenge that is presented by complex history. One wants to say, no, this is about us being democratic now. The us always has that. So that's what the Iranian version of that. And with an added twist. So yeah, there's the mullahs and there are the people in the street, and there's the Shah and the people who still would rather have the Shah or successors to the Shah's regime. And there's 4,000 years of Iranian history, right? So the claim to Iranianness isn't just a fairly recent claim, and it's got to be complicated by different associations. People, are struggling. We are not saying that we're not Muslim. We're saying you're bad government, right? I mean, that there are ways to try to navigate potential, misunderstandings or distortions from outside.
Yeah.
How's that playing out?
Well, now we have to wade into these sort of waters of church and state, right? I mean, I think actually the historical context is important, right? Because there's that question of like, what is Iran? What is Iranianness? Who are Iranians? And I think, right now there's been sort of an illusion or suturing of Iran with Islam. And it's like, wait a second, let's go back to empire. Iran is not all Islam, right? You've got this rich history of Zoroastrianism.
Sure.
You've got so many
Persian
religions.
Christians are very
Persians,
expensive.
exactly, Persian Christians, you've got a long tradition of Sufis, right? Of all these different faiths that make up Iran. And you've also got a long tradition of secularism as well, right? When you think about, even going back to Cyrus the Great and Darius the First, and you think about these early human rights declarations, right? And you even go to Persepolis and you see the carvings on the walls and the role of secularism and discourses about human rights carved into stone.
Which makes Persepolis such an evocative symbol now, in
Islamic
contrast to
realm.
the Muslims and in circulation with
Exactly.
film and all this sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly right. And so that overlay of Islam and this interpretation of Islam as you know, Islam qua Iran, Iran qua Islam is challenging. And I think that's one of the things that the protesters are trying to break and say, wait a second, you know, yes, there's religion, yes, and some of us are very, you know, our faith is incredibly important to us. But the way in which faith is being used to govern, and I mean, many would argue abused, right?
Right.
In sort of faith, this kind of power is incredibly problematic, right? This sort of abuse of Islam, right? Or abuse of faith. And that is really challenging for a whole new generation who are trying to explore their faith, right? And then that gets to that question of like, how do you get to embrace your faith and be in a democratic society where, you know, that separation of church and state? And I think what's interesting about what you said, Nathan, about, you know, the colonizers and being China from Hong Kong, in essence, in Iran, the colonizers are the Islamists, right? Or how power is operating, right? So there's a feeling of that. And then the other component I wanted to go back to was that the visual, which we should definitely get back to, but and like I would never throw in Foucault other than I'm sitting next to you. I'm sitting next to Craig Halpin and I feel like I can throw in Foucault here. But you know, that his essay on visual parrhesia, right? And this idea that, you know, when you take a picture, when you document something visually, that adds a sort of new dimension to it. Right. So I think we have to not lose that thread of thought as well. But to your point about like colonialism representation, but really this is about church and state, right? And kind of with Iran, it's that overlay that complicates matters for people who do embrace and love their faith. I mean, and that's why I keep telling people when I'm interviewed, like, it's not about hijab in the sense of they're saying no hijab. They're not saying no religion. And the protests are not against religion. The protests are against the way in which religion is operating in a problematic way.
So coerced religion is not freedom in your religion.
Right.
And I think this issue of religious freedom is there. And so resisting Foucault for a moment, or not resisting going
Yeah,
there,
let's get it.
just, you know, so one other thing. So another commonality, implicit percent, is both China and Iran were empires that transformed themselves into nation states. So part of the longer story is of a transformation of an imperial history into a self-understanding of a modern nation state. And you know, that figures in the May 4th movement in China and in lots of the rest of late Qing understandings. The figures in the long history of transition that is never completed in this sense for Iran. Now, my question, one other twist, if that's a commonality, a difference, though not night and day, is the large Iranian diaspora.
Sure.
So what happens in Iran today plays out before an audience of Iranians, say in Southern California, among other places not randomly chosen. It's certainly true that there is now a much bigger Hong Kong diaspora, partly because of what Beijing has done in Hong Kong, but not comparable to the Iranian diaspora, and in a sort of different question about it because it's in a complicated relationship to the rest of the Chinese diaspora. That, you know, is a question, but it's more recent. But the Iranian diaspora is a fairly long-standing diaspora, large, prosperous, and still very attentive to Iran.
Very.
So how does this complicate the movements today and
the question of representation, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
who is represented? Is it the diaspora, and then the diaspora itself is also multi-layered and multi-dimensional, right?
And multi-layered, but also I think, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but divided along the lines of some of these political options.
Right, monarchy, right? You've definitely got, and it depends on where we're talking about. We're talking about Southern California, we're talking about LA, are we talking about, you know, Tehrangeles? Are we talking about Beverly Hills?
Yeah.
And then, right, I mean, let's be honest, right? And, or are we talking about Long Island, Great Neck, Long Island? Or are we talking about DC? I mean, each of these pockets has a slightly different bent. And while for a time it was thought, well, most of the Iranians in diaspora are secular, we see that that's not necessarily the case, right? And so you're also seeing some of these tensions rehashed in the diaspora with people kind of finger pointing, accusatory, oh, well, this is happening because of you. Oh, you're actually a covert spot, you know, you're an apologist for the regime, you're, you know, all the controversy around various organizations that has emerged in the last couple of weeks. And so that complicates things because it means that the diaspora can't come together, right? That social capital is draining when you have these kinds of fractions and these divides. And that's the part that, you know, I'm not as optimistic about, right? I try to be an eternal optimist. I do think this is a moment of positive change. However, when we talk about the diaspora, it's much harder for me to be optimistic.
So, and this is part of the future predicament for Hong Kong, right? I mean, that it hasn't been as much a part of explaining anything in recent Hong Kong movements. It certainly is for China. I mean, go back to Sun Yat-sen and so forth. I mean, the role of the Chinese diaspora in Chinese political change, but for future potential Hong Kong mobilizations and renewal of democracy, they play out in relationship to now as significant. That's right.
I'm going to shift to questions.
Oh,
and
good.
I think I will handle it in part
Do that. So,
because, well, in part because I think you've laid so much on the table that we can have questions addressed to you as well as both of the speakers. So yes, so please ask away. And as I said, you don't have to identify yourself, but just ask your question.
Okay, you mentioned Foucault, I feel actually we need to mention Habermas.
I know. I'm gonna go to Habermas.
We are at UC Irvine in the humanities school, which has a certain reputation for critical.
Are we gonna-
I didn't shut your off.
But no, actually, just thinking about that because, you know, this whole idea of the public sphere and the internet and social media as a public sphere that for a while is operating more outside the bounds of some of these regimes. But in reality, right, the idea of publicness, the actual German meaning of openly kind of public, but being public, performing publicly, it's really being in the streets, right, that we see in Hong Kong, what was going in Iran now, in Egypt. And in fact, in 2019, when you said it, it just struck me, in 2019, they had Iraq protests in Algeria, they had the Sudanese revolution, we had protests, where else? All protests again in Egypt, the biggest protest in 2011, were in Egypt in 2019. There was something going on in a lot of places in that year that the pandemic sadly cut off.
So we had a pop-up event here where we actually had Haiti, Chile, and Beirut were the focus of those. Yes, so yeah.
There was something going on, but I just wonder, when I hear that, this whole idea of the colonizing, can a country that wasn't formally colonized be colonial to its own citizens? And I think that's something that people don't get, that all the inherent coloniality of all modern states, and that it's not really surprising that the Chinese government seems like a colonial occupier to part of its own population of the Iranian government. In Egypt, I remember running into a kid that had a end the occupation t-shirt on Palestine. He was from one of these Palestine solidarity groups. During the revolution in 2011, I said, why do you have this on? He said, because we're occupied, just like Palestinians, the same way. And that's something I think scholars need to think a lot more of, like how all modern states behave colonially to their citizens, especially authoritarian ones, in ways that, you know, Latin American theorists have been at the forefront of thinking that, but it really works all over. Maybe it's a good idea for a workshop.
That I would suggest. It's an occasion for the decolonial discourse in Latin America, absolutely. But then think about Britain and internal colonialism. Britain in relationship to Ireland, Wales, and England in relation to Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, and Britain in relation to all of them. So another layer of the complexity in relation to Britain and Hong Kong and stuff is Britain has lots of dimensions of this, including the internal colonialism that goes on. And I'll quickly, by not quite Habermasian response to that invocation, say, Absolutely, is in the streets, but also in the papers and in the visual media, right? And so we aren't going to get publicness right today if we're too nostalgic about earlier images and big mass protest images, as well as other things that are going on, like that circulation of images, I think. And we need all of this in play, like longer instead. There was another question
Other
on the same
questions?
side there.
There must be more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, Nathan, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, since you've left Hong Kong, what other kinds of activist groups, exile or not, that you've been able to, you found it easier to build solidarities with? Or are there groups that you maybe found it surprisingly difficult to build solidarities with?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it also is about how we can grow our diaspora community and make it effective in terms of how we can put more pressure on the Chinese government and try to change the situation. As I said, like in the 80s and 90s, there were a few ways of Hong Kong immigration, but they, in terms of the political the political factor of it is drastically different from the immigration wave that we have now. For example, in the UK, we've already had more than 140,000 Hong Kong people apply for a visa scheme to relocate to the UK, and I think most of them have already come. So we're talking about really a growing diaspora community with a very clear political stance that they want democracy, that they leave Hong Kong because of political persecution, which if you compare to the previous waves, they were more like economic immigration, that they don't necessarily have that kind of like strong idea of how to maintain a very politically strong diaspora community. So we've got that basis ongoing, but the question is how we can manage difference, how we can like minimize internal conflicts, given that there are always different groups of people with different political ideology and different ways of like understanding or different way of perceiving how change is possible and the theory of change. So I think one of the important thing is first of all, we need to build strong base on our cultural and community influence, and we need to engage with different groups in a more regular basis, and also we need to try to find common grounds that we can work together. I think one of the examples is the Tibetan dissident group have been doing I think in quite a positive way is they kind of like manage the very big ideological notions, which, well, whether they should like one country, two system, or like Tibet version or Tibetan independence, like there are always negotiation in between on these two big notions, and they kind of like manage to work together even though they have that kind of like differences. And I think that is something that like Hong Kong, the Diaspora Group can learn from and continue to build on that. But I think we've got advantage, which for now, as this wave of immigration, we already had a very strong consensus on certain things, because we're coming out from the same movement, and this movement we've got different big ideas penetrating. So I think we already got a more kind of like consensus building process, and I think that gives us an advantage to manage the difference and to still work together.
Go ahead.
No, I want to go back to Habermas. Sorry, because I heard you say Habermas, and I heard you also talk about publics, and I was thinking, because I heard you speak about that, I was thinking about publics and counter publics, and then that kind of sutures to your question about activism, right? And the question for me is like, what's the counter public and what's the public, right? And at what point, like we keep talking about that tipping point. At what point does it flip? And when are these protesters the counter and when are they the public? And how do you measure that when you're thinking about building activism through a kind of street politics? And that I think is where Habermas is really useful in saying, okay, is it the counter or the public, right? The counter public or the public? And there, I think it's useful for us to think about, okay, as we ask ourselves, where are these movements going? Are they just a footnote? Where are they going? I think we have to talk about going from being a counter public to a public.
So let me jump in on this and then try out the question I wanted to ask. Nathan, so the funny history, I'm going to be a pedant for a moment about the counterpublic Thomas. The counterpublic idea comes in from two Habermasians of Knecht and Kluge. Austrian analyst Kluge come to be a filmmaker, and they are writing a book called The Public Sphere and Experience in response in the 60s, and in response to an entirely sort of textual, discursive Habermasian account of the public. They want experience in there with film and music and other things. It's from Mark here. But the extent to which that's not just more media doing the same thing, it's other kinds of experience. And the public counter-public split has been taken in lots of different ways. It's Fraser, McMorn, lots of places. An issue with it, though, it seems to me, is that we risk losing sight of something we were talking about under the label representation, but I want to give a different label to it and say the difficulty of saying we. Because I think a problem for all such movements is finding a persuasive and not too complicated way to say we, as in the we, the people of the American Declaration of Independence. And you can then turn around, and lots of people have deconstructed, well, who were the people? They were the privileged, rich, white men, right? But they succeed in claiming a we that will be very powerful for democracy. And democracy without the ability to say we is almost impossible. And so in every one of these contexts, it's not representation as something out there. It's the ability to say we that is so important. And my question, so I almost for a moment heard Nathan saying, we fled Hong Kong to Britain because we saw that Britain had stable and effective government. But my more serious point about this is one of the things that happens to Asperger is things like this Manchester incident that has taken place and continuing interventions from the Chinese government into the diaspora, including efforts to pit people against each other in the diaspora. How big a deal is that for Tom?
Yeah, I think the question comes to how we can form long-lasting identity, and we build on that identity to manage difference and try to grow the community. There are many ways that people form their identity, but one of the ways, or one of the thing that really glue Hong Kong people together after 2019 is suffering, the common experience. I think it played a really big role in, even though there is a very diverse political community of Hong Kong people, but we still maintain to use one we to kind of like include us, because we've been through the same thing together. We've had those like rubber bullets and tear gas time. We've suffered, we see each other as our fellows. And with that bonding of almost like a family comes into place because of the shared experience. It's easy for us to manage difference and find common grounds and find consensus. So I think that's also really, especially we're kind of like first generation of diaspora community. We've all been there. We've all been through the 2019-2020 movement. So that kind of understanding and mutual support and consensus building has been already very strong. So I think that really plays into how we can for now really think of a very good and strategic plan for our diaspora community, building up that in order to avoid a lot of problem arise from those different fractions and like fractions like competing or fighting against each other because of lack of trust, lack of understanding, lack of communication, or just if you like that different people. But the second thing I want to come in is like we've been talking tipping point, we've been talking like whether there will be a concept like when it will succeed, when it will succeed. But for me, as a practitioner and as a person who've been like talking to a lot of like activists, also protesters, I don't think that is always in their mind, like calculating when it will be successful. As I said, like there has been a continuity, like in terms of understanding social movement, and it also applies to understanding their role in history, their role in that like long river of resistance. And for some, they really had a rather noble idea of they're laying a brick for the whole path of democracy, that that their effort transcends time, that it doesn't have to be done to be successful. It could be next generation. They're just like being there to serve that great history. So I think that also plays into the idea that, well, even though we know the kind of government is so powerful and it's so seemingly for now it's impossible to defeat them. But at the end of the day, we still come out. At the end of the day, we still believe that, well, even though we will be sacrificing in different ways, there's a value.
I was just going to say with that, maybe one of the things is to flip the we to the they. With both of these movements, what was surprising while the Hong Kong protests were going on, and was surprising in a way with the Iranian one, is how long things continued, even after a level of repression. And in each case, I think, even though there were many different issues that got raised and demands that were made, a fundamental thing was a moral sense that the security forces or the police were morally in the wrong and were not representing the community anymore. And the language of familial ties, of kind of connection, siblinghood, and older generations to younger in the Hong Kong movement came out quite specifically. And Carrie Lam presented herself as mother to the people. And then a group of mothers took to the streets and said, no, actually what Hong Kong mothers do is support their children when they're in the right. And there was a language of family, and there was a language of, even though there were many different grievances, this idea of the they was a uniting force for the we. And this is, of course, something we see in many other kind of political movements too. It doesn't mean that you end up with a success. And I think the point that Nathan was saying about this awareness of movements that fail or that hit roadblocks and then people continue is a fascinating one. And in the case of Iran, initially when the protests began, some people might have thought, here we go again, there's going to be a short-lived period where there's a lot of attention, and then we'll be back where we were before. And then the tipping point idea is, well, no, actually this is different. And in Hong Kong, in early 2019, I went to Hong Kong and I was going to be writing a book about Hong Kong protests. And I assumed it was going to end with the June 4th, 2019 vigil, and saying, how much longer will this be able to happen? Instead, that becomes the middle point, because that becomes the start of the movement. Nobody says, oh, you should really stay here through July, August, September. Then there are going to be masses of people on the streets. People had a kind of despondency. It felt like an endpoint, so that you don't know when the endpoint, and historically, we never know where the endpoint is. If you interviewed Václav Havel in 1975, you'd say, well, how does it feel? You know, Prague had this big deal in the 1960s, and there's been nothing since then. In 1985, you might have said the same thing. And yet then in 1980, so it's no surprise, I think, that in Hong Kong, there are people who are reading Havel a lot and talking about Mandela a lot. People who face these seeming endpoints.
But there are also people writing poetry and making films, and right, so it's worth noting that another part of this, when we talk about, say, media, isn't just media images of protests,
Right.
Or things directed. It is cultural creativity. Part of democratic freedom, part of the freedom valued in Hong Kong and in Iran is cultural freedom. Freedom to be a cultural producer of different things, and something like the film tradition that keeps alive a kind of critical consciousness, just barely escaping censorship some of the time,
Yeah.
right? Is really important to continuity during protest. And Hong Kong likewise has a continuity of intellectual and cultural creativity that is making Hong Kongness as an identity. It's part of that story, right?
Yeah.
You brought a point, you're sitting between the two conflicted areas. you brought a point, a phrase, we the people in US. I want to know what is the commonality, what is the thread that goes between these such a diverse American ideology, race, beliefs, political and otherwise, that makes we the people in America. The reason I'm asking that is I like to see that with diversity we have over here, how can that be the people could be applied to Iran with different Baluch, Turk, Kurdistan, Loristan, whatever, and also different ideology. What is that we the people in America? What does that mean? Who are those? What is the threat?
So I'm going to assume that's partly a question for me, that you should feel.
No,
free
you
to
all
jump
can
in
answer,
on it.
but I want, you brought it up, it's just
Yeah, no,
as an American, what do you? what-
I want to take it on. So I think this is a great part of the American history, and it is an endangered part, and it's turning out to be a hard to exploit part. So that's what I mean, this we the people sense was never perfect in America. There are sort of, strengthening of that solidarity and fractioning and division and civil war. The democracy in America was built, not just freedom. People say, oh, it's about the free system, not just equality, sometimes more equal than Europe had been, but solidaristic. It was actually about connections and sharing. Now, I think we have in many ways in the last 50 years seen an erosion of our ability to say we the people. And so when we say learn from America, we can't just mean learning from the successes of earlier periods. And we'll say, oh, we're a nation of immigrants and look how people have been integrated, without looking at the more recent history and saying, look at the problems of this. Look at old and new racisms colliding in recent years and so forth. So you have to be chastened by the picture of the degenerations recently in what had previously been in many ways a success story, and is still in some part, right? In America, among other things, we'll have discussion of Hong Kong, discussion of Iran, and a variety of other histories, all of which have reflections in contemporary America because of immigrant communities. But we have are in a period of relative weakness in our ability to say we the people. We are polarized politically. We are geographically divided, not just red states, blue states, or north-south or something like that, but urban and rural or small town mentalities. We are in different media silos, different messages, we go on and on, right? So we have allowed ourselves to become very disunified. And the people who are most actively saying we the people are also saying those other Americans are not the people, right?
I didn't see that we the people on January 6th.
Well, let me tell you what I saw on January 6th. I saw I saw a terrible event in which a bunch of people were saying we the people, knowing that they were a minority, but thinking that they were the true people. And I think that's very dangerous. I mean, that was an insurrectionary movement as far as I'm concerned. And there are people who claim to be the people and weren't. But what it reveals is how troubled we are with this. Now, if I were to go, let's say, look around the edges of the Black Sea and say, how do we get any common consciousness? How do we get a cooperation to deal with the environmental problems in the area among groups of people who share common histories and sometimes languages and religions and absolutely do not share a sense of being common, we the people. Not even the long band of Turkic people speaking Turkic languages feel they are fully integrated or something. So when does that get more split and fractionated? Partly when there are active outside meddlers who are trying to change the alignments. That's one thing that goes on. And partly when there are economic stakes for dividing in all of this. Partly in the interactions of religion and politics, right? But there are a bunch of factors. This isn't a seminar on Eurasia, but what we're going to say is the enmities are not always equally strong. And we need to look at what worsens or makes them better and not just sort of say, oh, that region, it's hopeless, or here it's good.
Because in each case, we have, times when it gets much worse, times when cooperation becomes easier to organize and all of this. So that's not a very complete answer to say, how can we take the spirit of we the people into these other places and populations that you asked. I think it would be wonderful if there is a stronger sense of solidarity, and a starting point would just be, and I think each of these cases, if I can represent an American case here in this, but each of these cases is a reminder that part of democracy is solidarity, that democracy is not just freedom and equality, because freedom and equality, your country can fall apart. You need peoplehood, you need solidarity to have democracy, to say we the people.
Take another question here. Yeah.
I just want to thank Jeff for making this happen. It's such a brilliant idea to bring Hong Kong and Iran together. I wanted to say that some of us here live in Hong Kong, and we elected Nathan to be the legislator. We were heartbroken to see him, first of all, disqualified, and then second of all, went into jail, and then, very, very lately exiled. So it's just, thank you for bringing him to here. But my question is actually for Professor Madavi. I also wanted to say the Hong Kong protest really woke up a lot of Hong Kong people. We started to, look at situation in Ukraine. What is the name of that documentary?
Winter on Fire.
Winter on Fire, talking about representation. People start to think, a lot of us in the Hong Kong used not to think people refer, well, why do we care about, those regions, right? But then the 2019 protest really was maybe a kind of a tipping point. A lot of us changed our minds, our perspective, and the way we see the world. And so I'm a teaching faculty member in Hong Kong, and I actually taught the Iranian Islamic Revolution last year. and students were just, wow, that was such a tragedy, because people were trying to overthrow the Shah, but then didn't know what was coming next. So my question is, you talked about this intergenerational solidarity, and you mentioned about young women as young as 10-year-old coming out. I'm just super curious. So gender and generation seems to stand out a lot in the latest resistance. Can you say a little bit more about it? And so is it predominantly women who are participating? What about how do men feel about it? Do they also join it massively? So yeah, and the generation issue is also very I'm very curious about it, because in the situation of Hong Kong, a lot of older generations people are broadly pro-government, so then it became very divisive also. So,
Yeah, and I think that was the case in Iran, when I first started studying it, right? You had this generational split to an extent, right? You had the older generations that were perhaps more pro-regime. And now, and back to those divides, urban, rural, those divides have been elided, right? Everybody's out now protesting against the regime, which is fascinating. But you asked about gender, and I think that that's an important thread not to lose, because yes, it is absolutely women and girls at the forefront, because women have the most to lose under the Islamic Republic. I mean, what ignited this round was the death of a Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, right? A woman who was arrested and harassed by the morality police for a headscarf that was slipping, right? So that if there's no other demonstration of how much women have to lose, that's definitely a demonstration. So I think women are, and actually have been for over a century, at the forefront. That goes back to 1910s, the Mashrute Revolution, the Constitutional Revolution. Women were at the forefront there. You see women's bodies are often the way in which power is operationalized in the long history of Iran, right? You have the revolution, and then there's law enacted about chador from head to toe. Then what I love about this generation, what kind of inspired me to study them, my own generation in the late nineties was that they were using their bodies to speak back. They were kind of subverting that. They were flipping the script on it. All that to say, though, that it's not just women, it is women and men, as it has been for at least, since I've been studying it. But it's important to note that it's led by women, and the men do support. When it comes to the intergenerational component, it's also led by schoolgirls and then followed by boys, right? So the fact that women and girls see their potential in all of this is pretty significant, I would say. And it kind of goes back to Nathan's point about suffering, the who is the we and who is the they, right? And the we as forming in and through this feeling of betrayal, right? So who is the they? The they are the betrayers, right? They betrayed us. They said they were bringing us a certain government and they haven't, which is what brought the older generations on side. Who is the we? We are the people suffering, right? We are the people who've been suffering and who have been betrayed. And so because women are the ones who have suffered so much under this regime, the we is inevitably going to be led by women who've been suffering.
I think with that pulling back to the very first question of things of betrayal is a perfect ending point. Thank you all so much. No, we could have gone on.
Sorry, a chance to bring it back to the CI.